Under the cold rain, a wounded German shepherd appears. At the edge of a quiet town, eyes filled with both fear and hope. No one knows where he came from or what he's been through until a stranger stops and fate begins to change for them both. From that moment, every heartbeat tells a story of loyalty, pain, and the silent bond between man and dog. But what the German shepherd reveals next will leave everyone breathless. The wind that moved through Pittsburgh that evening had the sound of metal scraping on stone. It slipped under the bridge where Luke Morgan sat with his back against a cold pillar, a folded tarp, and an old blanket the only barrier between him and the winter ground. Beside him lay Kaiser, his German shepherd 7 years old, calm and watchful, his fur heavy with frost. Every time Luke exhaled, a small cloud rose in front of him, and for a moment it looked like smoke from a campfire that had long burned out. Luke had once known noise engines' radio calls, the dry echo of boots on sand. Now his world was made of silence and wind. The city hummed above the bridge, but down here everything moved slower. He rubbed his hands together, feeling the cracked skin sting under the cold. Kaiser lifted his head, his amber eyes glowing faintly in the half-light, waiting for a sign, a word. Any small command that meant the night would be all right. Luke's gaze drifted toward the river. The water was half frozen, pushing small pieces of ice downstream like broken glass. He tried to focus on that movement, because it was easier than the scenes that came uninvited, the smell of diesel, the sound of a snapped cable the moment everything in him split apart. In Afghanistan, he had been a sergeant, steady and responsible. Dean Walker had been his closest friend, loud kind, always joking even when sandstorms turned the world to dust. Dean had a photo taped to the dashboard of their truck, his wife and a baby girl who had just learned to stand. That day they were fixing a recovery vehicle. Luke had been standing 20 feet away when the hiss of the hydraulic line filled the air. A sound too familiar, too wrong. Then came the snap, a flash of metal, and a sound that would never leave him. The vehicle's arm dropped in a heartbeat. Dean didn't even have time to turn. Afterward came the silence, the paperwork, the smell of disinfectant, and Captain Alex Hunter sitting across a table. Luke remembered the captain's voice, flat, polite, deadly calm, as he signed a report blaming Dean for his own death. Operator error, it said. Luke had tried to speak to explain about the cheap replacement parts, but Hunter's stare had shut every door. The contract is vital, he had said. You will confirm this version, Sergeant. That was the day Luke learned how truth could be buried with a pen. Now, the memory was as heavy as the steel beams above his head. He closed his eyes and let the noise of passing traffic fill the spaces between his thoughts. Kaiser pressed closer, his weight steady, his breathing slow and certain. The dog's warmth pulled Luke back from the places that tried to swallow him. Good boy, Luke whispered. His voice was rough, tired. We made it another night. Kaiser's tail brushed the concrete twice, a quiet answer. He was more than a dog. He was the only witness left to a life that had broken and kept going anyway. From above came the sound of footsteps. 2 workers in orange vests were moving along the bridge, their flashlights sweeping the dark. Luke straightened already, knowing what was coming. One of the men stopped, spotted him, and sighed. Sir, the man said gently, you can't stay here anymore. City's clearing the area. New directive. Luke nodded. He didn't argue. Orders were orders, even when they came from strangers with clipboards. He began folding the tarp, tucking his few belongings into a small backpack. A dented pot, a bit of bread, a packet of dog food, and a photo of himself in uniform, creased, water-stained, but still showing 2 men smiling against the sun. He looked at it once more, then slipped it into his pocket. Come on, boy, he murmured. Kaiser stood stretched and shook the frost from his coat. His breath puffed in small silver clouds as he waited for Luke's slow step. Together they pushed a shopping cart filled with their life's weight toward the end of the bridge. The wheels squealed against the frozen concrete. Above them, cars passed without slowing headlights, sweeping the dark like brief flashes of another world. The city looked endless from here. Gray towers, steam rising from vents, a few people moving fast with collars turned up. Luke's knee ached with every step, a reminder of old shrapnel. Kaiser walked close, his body brushing Luke's leg, guiding him through the patches of ice. They passed under streetlights where the snowflakes looked golden before hitting the ground. Luke thought of warmth, of a cup of coffee, of a door that opened to a room that didn't ask questions. The thought faded quickly, replaced by the heavy rhythm of his boots on the sidewalk. Every sound mattered out here. The rustle of plastic in the cart, the distant hum of a siren, the whisper of wind through metal railings. Yet the city never truly noticed them. People passed and turned their faces away, not out of cruelty, but because they didn't know where to look. Luke didn't mind. He had learned long ago that peace sometimes meant invisibility. By the time they reached the end of the bridge, snow had begun to fall harder, filling the air with soft white noise. He stopped under a flickering streetlight and looked at the river again, remembering how it had once carried barges of steel from the factories that gave the city its bones. Now the factories were dead shells, their windows black, their chimneys broken. Kaiser stopped too, ears twitching, nose lifted to the wind. He looked up at Luke, waiting. "Yeah," Luke said quietly. "We'll find a place." He turned toward the old industrial district, where the streets ran narrow between forgotten warehouses. The cold there had a deeper bite, the kind that wrapped around bones and waited. Yet somewhere beyond those ruins, there would be walls and a roof, maybe even a door that still closed. As they walked, Luke noticed how Kaiser's paws left perfect prints in the thin layer of snow, a straight line beside his own uneven trail. That small symmetry calmed him more than any promise could. It meant they were still together, still moving. A bus rumbled past, brakes hissing, and for a second the sound threw Luke backward, through time, the same hiss that had come before the scream of the hydraulic line. His chest tightened, breath short. Then Kaiser nudged his hand, grounding him. Luke blinked hard, forcing the present back into focus. He looked down at the dog and managed a faint smile. "You keep me sane, you know that." Kaiser tilted his head as if to listen, his expression patient, almost human. The sky above the city was turning the color of dull steel. Night would come soon. Luke felt the urgency that always came before darkness. Find shelter, find warmth, find a place to stop. The air smelled of snow and rust and river water. They turned onto a service road lined with chain-link fences. Behind one of them, a shape loomed against the fading light, a massive structure of rusted beams and shattered glass. The sign was barely readable, its letters worn and pale, but Luke could still make them out. Meridian Steelworks. The factory stretched into the distance like the skeleton of a giant. Luke stared at it for a long moment. A place abandoned for decades, forgotten by everyone except the wind. It wasn't safety, but it was shelter. And sometimes shelter was enough. He touched Kaiser's head lightly. "That's our stop for tonight." The dog's ears flicked forward, ready. Together they walked toward the broken fence, their shadows long and thin in the fading light. The snow thickened, turning the air white. Luke's breath came out steady now, guided by the rhythm of purpose. He didn't know that inside those rusted walls waited a story buried in dust and silence, one that would pull him from the edge of despair and give him back a reason to stand. And as the last trace of daylight vanished behind the river's fog, Luke and Kaiser stepped through the gap in the fence, leaving the bridge and the past behind them, walking straight into the mystery that had been waiting all these years. The Meridian Steelworks stood at the edge of the city like a sleeping monster made of iron and smoke. Its towers rose against the cloudy sky, their edges eaten by rust, their windows shattered into jagged teeth. The air smelled of metal rain and old dust. It was the kind of place where even echoes seemed afraid to stay too long. Luke and Kaiser reached the fence just as the last light faded. A gap near the loading dock waited like an open mouth. Luke pushed the cart as far as it would go, then left it behind. The metal wheels groaned once and went still. He crouched low, lifted the broken edge of the chain link, and whispered, "Come on, boy." Kaiser slipped through first, silent and smooth. His body brushed against the wire and small bits of frost fell to the ground. Luke followed, his hands rough from the cold metal. On the other side, the air felt heavier, older, like time had stopped moving years ago. Inside the fence, the world was quiet. The snow covered everything in a thin gray blanket. Broken trucks sat with flat tires, their paint peeled away by rain and years. The great warehouse doors were half open, frozen in place. Luke hesitated for a moment, looking up at the dark sky. "Home for tonight," he said softly. The echo of his own voice came back hollow and far away. They entered through a side passage where the door had rusted off its hinges. The inside smelled of damp concrete oil and decay. Long beams of moonlight slid through the shattered skylights, painting the ground with thin silver lines. Every sound they made, each step, each breath, spread across the vast empty space like ripples on still water. Luke walked slowly, scanning every corner as if the shadows might move. The floor was littered with bolts, old tools, and glass. Kaiser moved close beside him, tail low, ears forward. His paws made soft clicks on the concrete, steady, cautious, certain. "Easy," Luke murmured. "Just passing through." They passed giant furnaces, now cold as stone, silent cranes hanging from rails, and stacks of metal parts that looked like skeletons of forgotten machines. Once this place had burned day and night, feeding the city with steel and fire. Now it was a graveyard of work and noise, a body without a heartbeat. Luke stopped near the center of the foundry floor. He could see his own breath floating in front of him. He thought about how many men had stood here, their sweat mixing with smoke, their hands shaping the bones of buildings that still stood downtown. He imagined them leaving one by one, their voices fading as the machines stopped forever. His chest tightened. He knew what it meant to be left behind. They moved toward the back of the building, where smaller structures stood in the shadows. Storage rooms, offices, workshops. Most doors were locked or collapsed inward. But one building looked different, a short brick box with a small window still intact. The faint glow of the moon touched its sign, worn, an almost unreadable security office. Luke stepped closer. The door was thick wood, swollen by years of rain, but still standing. He pushed it once and it resisted, then gave way with a deep groan of rusted metal. The sound echoed through the dark like a sigh from the building itself. He clicked on a small flashlight from his keychain. The weak beam cut through the dust, revealing a single small room. A steel desk stood against the far wall, covered in papers that had melted into gray pulp. A broken chair leaned nearby, its wheels frozen in place. The window, though coated in grime, had no cracks. The roof above looked solid. Luke let out a slow breath. "We'll take it," he whispered. He dropped his pack by the wall, rolled out his sleeping bag, and checked the corners for holes. Dry. Safe enough. Kaiser sniffed every inch of the room, nose moving, tail flicking, before finally circling twice and lying down near the door. His body was a dark shadow against the pale floor. Luke sat on the ground, his back against the wall. The flashlight rested on the desk, its beam pointing up toward the ceiling, filling the small space with a quiet amber light. Outside, the wind howled through cracks in the steel walls, making a sound that could almost be mistaken for voices. Luke listened for a long time, not moving, letting his breathing match the rhythm of the air. He looked at Kaiser. The dog's eyes glowed softly in the dim light. They had walked through too many nights like this, cold, hungry, waiting for morning. Yet here inside this forgotten place, Luke felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: stillness. He stretched his legs out and pulled the blanket over himself. His knee throbbed from the long walk, the old injury pulsing with the cold. He rubbed it once absently and closed his eyes. The warmth from Kaiser's body reached him like a slow-moving tide. The silence began to change. It wasn't just emptiness anymore. It had a shape, a weight. Luke could feel it pressing in from the walls, the air carrying a kind of waiting, as if the building was holding its breath. He stared at the ceiling, tracing the cracks with his eyes. "We've seen worse, haven't we?" he said quietly. Kaiser's ear twitched, a silent answer. For a moment, Luke thought about his old bunk overseas, the hum of the base generator, the voices of men he'd never see again. He remembered the laughter, the smell of coffee mixed with dust, the sense that each day had a purpose. He had traded that world for a life of drifting between bridges and shelters. A soldier turned invisible. He ran a hand through his unkempt hair and sighed. "Guess this is what's left, huh?" Kaiser lifted his head, rested it on Luke's knee, and exhaled a sound of quiet peace. The flashlight flickered once, then steadied. Luke reached for it and turned it off to save the battery. Darkness filled the room again, but it didn't feel hostile. It felt like a heavy blanket pulled over the noise of the world. The cold crept back slower now. Luke adjusted himself and leaned closer to Kaiser. The dogs shifted just enough for their bodies to touch. Together they breathed 2 heartbeats in the middle of a dead factory, surrounded by walls that had once known the sound of fire. Outside, snow began to fall again, tiny white flecks drifting through broken skylights. The flakes landed on rusted machines, on rails, and ladders on the remains of a city's pride. The steelworks, once alive with heat, was now wrapped in silence, its secrets sleeping deep under dust and time. Luke drifted toward sleep, his mind finally quiet. He dreamed not of war, but of small things: coffee steam, the weight of a dog's head on his knee, the simple comfort of being seen. In the corner, a faint draft stirred the dust. It moved the edge of a loose sheet of plywood leaning against the back wall, making it tremble ever so slightly, before settling again. Luke didn't see it. His breathing had slowed steady and deep. Kaiser's ears twitched, his nose lifting to the air. For a moment he watched the wall with quiet focus, then lowered his head back onto his paws. The building went still again, as if pretending to sleep with them. And beneath that silence, hidden behind the rust and concrete, something waited, something that had been buried for years, holding its breath for the day someone like Luke Morgan would walk through the cold and find it. Morning came slow and gray, leaking through the cracked window of the small security office. The light had no warmth, only the dull color of another hard day. Luke Morgan opened his eyes to the cold breath of winter pressing through the door frame. His bones ached. The air smelled of metal dust and the faint scent of dog fur mixed with smoke from last night's small fire. Kaiser was already awake, sitting near the door, his ears twitching as if waiting for orders that would never come. When Luke finally sat up, the dog turned tail, sweeping once against the floor. His eyes said what his mouth could not: "We're still here." Luke reached into his pack. The sight made his stomach drop. Half a bag of kibble for Kaiser. 1 dry piece of bread for himself. No coffee. No cash except for a few wrinkled bills and some coins wrapped in a plastic bag. He counted it $73 and change. It was all he had left from his last disability payment. He stared at the small pile of money and gave a tired laugh. "Guess we're rich, huh?" Kaiser tilted his head as if trying to understand the joke. Luke broke the bread in half. "You get breakfast first." He poured a handful of kibble onto a torn piece of cardboard, then ate his half of bread in slow bites. It tasted like air. He leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes. Every sound of the old steelworks felt louder in the quiet, the drip of melting frost, the rattle of wind through broken glass. His thoughts ran in circles. What next? Where to go? The shelters were full and most wouldn't take a dog. He wouldn't leave Kaiser. That was the one rule he never questioned. Something crinkled in his jacket pocket. He pulled it out, a wrinkled flyer he'd picked up days ago at a bus stop. Pine Ridge Storage Auction, cash-only delinquent units for sale. Luke looked at it for a long time. These auctions were a gamble, a long shot. People bid on other people's abandoned junk, hoping to find something they could sell. Usually, it was worthless. Sometimes it wasn't. He looked at Kaiser. "What do you think? One last roll of the dice?" The dog sniffed the flyer and sneezed. Luke smiled faintly. "I'll take that as a yes." He stuffed his few belongings into the backpack, tightened the straps, and stepped out into the cold. The city looked washed out, its streets painted in shades of steel and frost. He walked with his head down the leash, looped loosely around his hand. Kaiser trotted beside him, his breath rising like smoke in the morning air. The Pine Ridge storage facility sat at the far edge of town, rows of gray buildings with blue metal doors, each one numbered like cells in a giant concrete maze. A small crowd had gathered near the main office. Luke counted maybe 20 people. Most looked like professionals, warm coats, gloves, flashlights clipped to their belts. They carried themselves with the easy confidence of people who expected to win. Luke stayed near the back, feeling out of place in his old brown jacket and torn boots. Kaiser sat close, calm but alert, drawing a few curious looks. A man in an orange vest stepped forward holding a clipboard. His voice was brisk and practiced cutting through the cold. "All right, folks, welcome to Pine Ridge. Same rules as always. Look, don't touch cash, only pay immediately. You win it, you clear it in 48 hours. Let's move." This was Mason Lee, the auctioneer. His tone carried the rhythm of someone who had said the same words 100 times before. They started down the row of units. One by one, workers cut off the padlocks, rolled open the doors, and shined flashlights inside. Each time the crowd leaned forward, murmured, and the bidding began. A unit filled with antique furniture sold for $800. Another, packed with tools and equipment, went for $1,200. Luke didn't bid. He just watched. The money in his pocket felt smaller with every shout of "sold." By the time they reached the last building, Luke's breath had turned to a steady fog. Mason Lee stopped in front of a door marked 412. "All right, folks," he called, his tone light. "Last one for the day. Tenant delinquent, 9 months. Looks like a backload. Let's open her up." A worker cut the padlock and yanked the door upward. It jammed halfway before flying open with a metallic groan. A dark, wet smell rolled out, mold rot and old air trapped too long. The professionals took one look and stepped back unimpressed. Inside were sagging cardboard boxes, black plastic bags split open to show stained clothes, and a broken lamp lying on its side. The walls were marked with water streaks. $50 to start, Mason called out. "Come on, folks, help me clear it." 50, no one answered. 20, still silence. Mason looked around, his breath visible in the cold. His eyes landed on Luke. "You with the dog?" he said, half teasing, half hopeful. $20, it's yours." Luke's heart thudded once. It was stupid. It was hopeless. But so was standing still. He cleared his throat. 50. Someone in the back smirked and shouted, 60 just for fun. Luke felt his pulse rise. He hesitated, then said, 70. The man laughed and turned away. $70, Mason said, clapping his gloved hands together. Going once, going twice, sold to the gentleman with the dog. A few people chuckled as they walked off. Luke stepped forward, handed over his crumpled bills, and received a carbon copy receipt. Mason's voice softened as he passed it to him. "Good luck, friend." When the crowd disappeared, the lot fell silent again. Luke stood in front of Unit 412, the cold air burning in his lungs. "Well, boy," he murmured, "let's see what we bought." He pulled the door higher and stepped inside. The smell hit him like a wall. It was the heavy, wet odor of decay. He covered his mouth with his sleeve and switched on his flashlight. The beam revealed piles of ruined boxes. The first one collapsed under his touch, spilling out old newspapers fused into a soggy brick. Another held yellowed paperbacks that fell apart in his hands. Plastic bags were filled with clothes too moldy to touch. He worked for an hour, hoping for anything, a tool, an old radio, something that could be traded. Nothing. Every step stirred dust and failure. By the time he reached the back wall, his arms ached and his breath came hard. The cold crept up through the soles of his boots. He sank down onto the floor, leaning against a box that smelled like mildew and loss. His chest tightened. All the weeks of holding on, of telling himself things would turn cracked at once. He dropped his head into his hands. Kaiser moved closer, pressing his warm body against Luke's side. The dog's eyes watched him quietly, patient as always. Then his ears flicked. His nose lifted. He stood tail stiff and walked toward the far wall. Kaiser, Luke said wearily, "Leave it." But the dog didn't stop. He pressed his nose to the wall, sniffed, then began to scratch. The sound was sharp and steady claws on wood claws, on something that didn't belong. Luke frowned. "What is it, boy?" Kaiser scratched harder, a low, focused whine rumbling from his chest. Not excited. Not playful, purposeful. Luke sighed, wiped his eyes, and forced himself up. "All right," he muttered. "Show me." He walked over, shining his flashlight where Kaiser's paws had scraped the wood. At first he saw only the same old stains, dark from water and age. Then he noticed something strange. The marks ran in straight lines, two long seams side by side. He froze. The lines were too perfect to be water, too deliberate to be accident. Kaiser sat back, ears high, eyes locked on him. Luke's breath came slow and cold. His despair began to thin, replaced by something else, something electric. "Good boy," he whispered, running a hand over the dog's head. "You found something, didn't you?" The light trembled in his hand, and the shadows on the wall seemed to shift. Somewhere behind that damp wood waited an answer he hadn't asked for, an answer that would pull him far from the quiet ruin of his life. Luke took one step closer to the wall, the beam steady now. The dog at his side, both staring into the place where decay met mystery. The air inside the storage unit had turned heavy, thick with the smell of rot and dust. Luke stood near the back wall, his breath visible in the beam of his flashlight. Kaiser sat beside him, tail still, eyes locked on the dark plywood as if he could see through it. The dog's claws had scratched small marks near the bottom, and the sound still echoed in Luke's mind. He leaned closer, running his fingers along the surface. The so-called water stains were strange, two straight lines running from floor to ceiling, 3 feet apart, clean and exact. He frowned. Water didn't move that way. It spread and curved. These lines looked like edges, seams. "You're onto something, boy," Luke said quietly. He pressed his hand against the middle of the panel. It shifted slightly beneath his weight, giving a soft creak. Behind it came a faint draft of air, dry and cold. His pulse picked up. Luke stepped back and looked around the cluttered space. His flashlight landed on a rusted tire iron half buried under a pile of old rags. He picked it up and turned it over in his hand. The cold metal felt solid, heavy. Something made for work, not fear. He glanced down at Kaiser. "Stay back," he said. The dog lowered himself, eyes bright, watching every move. Luke wedged the flat end of the tire iron into the seam where the wood met the concrete floor. He leaned into it, shoulders tense, boots pressing against the ground. The damp plywood resisted, then gave way with a dull tearing sound. Old nails squealed as they loosened, and dust drifted into the air like smoke. One last push, and the panel came free, falling forward with a hollow thud. The sound echoed through the empty unit, then faded into silence. Behind the wall was a narrow cavity 2 feet deep, hidden between the plywood and the real concrete structure. The beam of his flashlight cut through the dust, landing on 3 objects sitting neatly on the floor of the hidden space. They weren't thrown in like trash. They had been placed with care. Luke crouched, heart pounding. The first was a small wooden box, dark and smooth, about the size of a book. Its corners were rounded from handling, and the grain of the wood glowed faintly under the light. The second was a manila folder, thick with papers sealed shut, with a circle of dark red wax. The wax carried a mark and emblem pressed deep into it, though he couldn't make out the design. The third was a metal case, heavy and rectangular, painted flat black. It looked military, like an ammunition box he had seen many times overseas. 3 combination locks secured its lid. Luke reached in carefully, as if the air itself might shatter them. The wooden box was light in his hands, the folder stiff, the metal case cold and solid. He placed them gently on the concrete floor of the unit and just stared for a long moment. The clutter of broken furniture and rotting paper around him seemed to fade away. What had looked like junk now felt like a graveyard holding a secret. Kaiser sniffed the boxes, nose twitching, then sat down beside them with a quiet sigh, as if claiming them as his find. Luke exhaled slowly. "You did good, partner," he murmured. His voice shook just a little. He wanted to open them right there to see what decades of silence had hidden. But the open unit felt too exposed. Anyone could walk by. The receipt he'd signed had his name. He was standing in plain sight of something valuable or dangerous. He gathered the items, slipping the wooden box and folder into his backpack. The metal case was too large, so he wrapped it in his old sleeping bag and tucked it under his arm. It was heavier than he expected, but adrenaline made the weight easy. As he stepped out into the open lot, the winter air hit him like ice. He pulled the rolling door down behind him until it was just a foot above the ground, enough space for them to slip back in if needed. The sound of the door closing was final, like sealing a chapter he didn't yet understand. Kaiser walked close at his side as they crossed the lot. The world outside felt sharper now. Every noise, the distant rumble of traffic, the whistle of the wind, made Luke's nerves tighten. He had no idea what he was carrying, but something deep in his gut told him it mattered. They made their way back across the bridge and into the skeletal heart of the Meridian Steelworks. The factory greeted them with its familiar stillness. Luke slipped through the broken fence, moving fast, his breath visible in the cold air. He returned to the small brick security office, the place that had become their home. Inside, he wedged the chair against the door and set the flashlight on the floor, the beam shining upward. He unwrapped the sleeping bag and placed the black metal case in the corner. Then he pulled out the other 2 items, the wooden box and the sealed folder, and sat cross-legged on the concrete. Kaiser lay beside him, head resting on his paws, watching quietly. Luke turned the wooden box over in his hands. Its hinges creaked softly, but he didn't open it yet. Instead, he reached for the folder. The wax seal was brittle with age. He hesitated, tracing the faint emblem with his thumb. There was something solemn about breaking it, like opening someone's last words. He took a deep breath, then pressed his thumb into the seal. The wax cracked with a dry snap. Inside were folded sheets of paper, yellowed and fragile. The handwriting was careful but uneven, written in blue ink that had faded almost to gray. The first line stopped him cold. "My name is Theodore Lawson. If you are reading this, I am dead." Luke's throat tightened. He kept reading. The letter spoke of fear and guilt. Theodore wrote that he had lived in hiding for 29 years, too afraid to speak, but too burdened to forget. His brother John Lawson had been an activist, a man who believed the old industrial lands of Pittsburgh could be healed. John had discovered corruption behind a major redevelopment deal involving powerful businessmen and city officials. He planned to expose them, but before he could, his office exploded in what was called a gas leak. The investigation ended in a week. It was declared an accident. Theodore confessed that it was no accident. He named names, hinted at bribes, and described how he had taken his brother's files and hidden them in this very unit. He had paid the rent until the end of his life, so that one day the truth might be found. Luke paused, his hand gripping the page so tightly it trembled. The words blurred for a moment before coming back into focus. The final paragraph struck like a whisper from the grave. "If you are reading this, you are my last witness. My brother's light was buried by fear and money. Please do what I could not. Bring his truth into the world. Tell his daughter Audrey what her father died for." Luke stared at the name, Audrey Lawson. He folded the papers slowly and placed them back inside the folder. For a long time he didn't move. The dim beam of the flashlight flickered against the walls, casting long, unsteady shadows. His mind drifted to another place, a sterile room, a captain's voice, a false report signed in ink. "Operator error. The contract is vital." Dean Walker had died for truth buried under convenience. John Lawson had died for the same. The faces blurred together in Luke's mind. Different men, same injustice. Kaiser shifted, pressing against him as if to anchor him back to the present. Luke placed a hand on the dog's back and felt the steady rise and fall of his breathing. He looked toward the corner where the black metal case sat silent and locked, holding whatever proof Theo had mentioned. Papers, photos, ledgers, maybe evidence strong enough to burn through decades of lies. Luke's heartbeat slowed into something steady, deliberate. He wasn't a soldier anymore, but something in him had reawakened. This wasn't chance, it was a mission. He sat there in the cold, the letter beside him. The dog closed the metal box, heavy with secrets. The wind outside moaned through the factory ruins like an old voice calling his name. Luke whispered to the dark, "We found it, Kaiser." The dog opened his eyes, golden and calm. "And tomorrow," Luke said, his voice low, filled with something that sounded like purpose, "we find out who they really were." The light flickered once more, then went still, painting them both in soft amber. A man, a dog, and the truth waiting to be unsealed. The morning light crept through the cracks in the security office roof, pale and tired, touching the edges of the metal case and the open letter on the floor. Luke sat still for a long time, staring at the faded ink, as if it could change if he just looked hard enough. Kaiser lay beside him, head on his paws, eyes half closed, but his ears moved at every sound, every drip, every sigh of the wind through broken glass. Luke read the letter again, slower this time, letting each word sink deep. The handwriting trembled across the page, written by a man who had carried guilt for too long. Theodore Lawson told the story from the beginning. His brother John Lawson had been a chemical engineer and an activist who believed the poisoned land of Meridian Steelworks could be reborn. The factory's closure in the 1980s had left behind not only unemployment, but also soil soaked with mercury and oil water thick with ash. John had started a cleanup project funded by small donations and volunteers. He called it New Ground, believing that the city deserved to heal. But then came Calvin Bishop, a rising real estate magnate, sharp in suits, smooth in words. He wanted the land for a massive shipping hub, a project that would bring money, jobs, and prestige. To the city council, Bishop was a savior. To John, he was a danger. The cleanup would stop. The contamination would be buried, not removed. And the people living near the river would keep breathing poison. Theo's letter described the months that followed in painful detail. Bishop's company began buying off inspectors. Reports were rewritten. Chemical samples were replaced. Anyone who asked questions was quietly transferred or fired. John refused to stop. He gathered documents, financial records, even secret recordings. He told Theo he was ready to go public. Then in March of 1996, John's office exploded. The police called it a gas leak. The newspaper called it a tragedy. Calvin Bishop called it an unfortunate accident during a promising redevelopment phase. Theo wrote that he had been the one to identify the body. My brother's hands, the letter said, were burned, but still clenched around a keychain with the initials JL, as if he was still holding on. Luke closed his eyes, his jaw tightening. He could almost see it. The flames, the noise, the same kind of chaos he had seen too many times overseas. Only this battle hadn't happened in a war zone. It had happened in an office against greed, against silence. Theo went on. After the funeral, Bishop approached him in private, offering help with the family's debts and a quiet suggestion to move on. Theo took the money, but not the advice. He gathered what John had left behind and sealed it in the ammunition case. Then he rented this storage unit under a false name and disappeared into small jobs and quiet fear. For nearly 30 years he had lived with that secret pressing on his conscience like a stone. The letter's last paragraph trembled with regret. If someone finds this, please take what I've hidden and deliver it to John's daughter, Audrey Lawson. She deserves to know the truth her father died for. I have failed him once. Don't let my silence become yours. Luke folded the letter and stared at it. The name Audrey Lawson echoed in his mind. He wondered where she was now, how old she might be. If John had died in 1996, then Audrey would be in her 30s. Maybe she still lived in the city. Maybe she had never stopped wondering why her father never came home. He looked around the small room. The walls of the steelworks seemed to lean closer, filled with ghosts of men who had worked here, fought here, and disappeared into history. The wind outside carried the same low hum as a memory from far away, a bass radio, a coded voice, a mission that had gone wrong. He thought of Dean Walker, the friend he'd lost in the desert, and how Captain Hunter had covered up the truth with a pen stroke. That memory burned through him like acid. Now here it was again, another man betrayed by power, another story erased by money. Luke pressed the letter flat on the floor, smoothing it with his hand. The ink bled faintly under his fingers. They always win, he whispered, his voice rough. Kaiser raised his head, watching him silently. Luke met the dog's steady eyes and felt something shift inside him, the same cold weight that had held him for years. The feeling of helplessness, of guilt of surviving when better men, had not begun to crack. No, he said quietly. The word came out small, but it carried strength. He stood and began to pace the letter still in his hand. They think they buried this. They think nobody will ever care. He looked at the metal case sitting in the corner, its 3 combination locks reflecting the dull light. But they didn't count on you, did they, boy? Kaiser wagged his tail once the sound soft against the floor. Luke sat again and reached out to stroke the dog's fur. The warmth under his hand was real alive grounding. We're not walking away from this, he murmured. Not this time. He imagined what might be inside that metal case, proof strong enough to shake walls, maybe even names that still held power in the city. If Calvin Bishop had built his empire on a lie, Luke was holding the match that could burn it down. For a moment, doubt tried to return. He was just a man sleeping in an abandoned factory with a dog. He had no money, no voice, no allies. But then he remembered the weight of Dean's dog tags in the sand, the silence that followed when he hadn't spoken up. That silence had haunted every step since. This time, he whispered to himself, we tell the truth. The decision settled over him like a calm he hadn't felt in years. The wind outside softened. Somewhere in the distance, a train rumbled past, a low, steady sound that seemed to move with his heartbeat. Luke took the letter and folded it carefully, sliding it into the pocket of his jacket. Then he dragged the metal case closer, feeling its cold weight against his legs. He ran a hand across the top, tracing the worn paint, the dented corners. 3 locks waited for their combinations, silent, patient, like the story itself. Kaiser leaned closer, pressing his nose to the case, and gave a small huff. Luke smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said. "Tomorrow." He turned off the flashlight to save the battery. The room went dim, lit only by the faint gray of morning. He lay down on the floor, the case beside him. Kaiser curled close. Sleep didn't come easily, but it came with purpose this time. The kind of rest a man takes when he knows the next day might matter. As Luke drifted toward dreams, the letter's words stayed in his head. Deliver it to Audrey Lawson. Her name felt like a direction, like a compass pointing out of the ruins. He didn't know where she was or what waited ahead. But one truth burned steady in his chest: the story that had begun in this broken steel mill wasn't over. And this time Luke Morgan would not stay silent. The gray dawn spread across the old steelworks like a sheet of ash. The air was still the kind that carried the sound of every footstep. Luke stood near the edge of the factory floor, staring at the black metal case in his hands. Frost clung to its corners, and the 3 combination locks stared back like cold eyes. He had read Theodore Lawson's letter again before sunrise, every line etched deep into his mind. The story of greed, death, and silence had become more than just words. It was a mirror. Luke knew what fear could do to a man. He had lived with it, let it eat him from the inside for years. But Theo's words were a warning truth, only mattered if someone was brave enough to carry it. Now that duty had passed to him. Luke pulled his coat tight and whistled softly. Kaiser appeared from the shadows, his fur dusted with frost tail, moving once in greeting. Luke nodded toward the tunnel beneath the main building, a low concrete passage that ran under the foundry floor left from the old drainage system. "Come on, boy," he murmured. "We're putting this where no one will find it." The tunnel's mouth yawned open like a wound in the ground. Luke crouched and slipped inside the beam of his flashlight, trembling over rusted pipes and flaking walls. Water dripped from above, 1 drop at a time, steady as a heartbeat. Kaiser followed his claws, clicking softly on the wet stone. Luke found a spot beneath a collapsed section of the old ventilation shaft. It was dry and hidden by a mound of debris. He took off his gloves, his fingers numb as he began to dig with a piece of broken metal. Each scrape against the dirt felt heavier than the last. When the hole was deep enough, he lowered the black case inside, resting it gently in the cold earth. He stared at it for a long moment. "You stay here," he whispered, "until I know where this road ends." Then he pushed the soil back, covering the case, until it disappeared beneath the dirt and darkness. The ground looked untouched again, as if it had been waiting for this secret all along. When Luke crawled out of the tunnel, the morning had grown brighter. Thin sunlight cut through the broken windows, lighting the dust like drifting snow. He brushed the dirt from his hands and turned to Kaiser. "Now we find her." Back in the small office, he opened the wooden box he had kept aside. The lid creaked softly. Inside were a few photographs wrapped in a brittle envelope. He lifted the first one carefully. It showed a man and a little girl standing in front of the steelworks gates. The man, John Lawson, had the confident smile of someone who still believed he could fix the world. The girl, Audrey, looked about 6 years old with curly hair and a grin that reached her eyes. Her small hand held his tightly. Luke studied the photo until his vision blurred. The background was the same place where he stood now, only decades apart, the same rusting gates, the same cracked ground. But in the picture, the sky was blue. Hope had once lived here. He found more photos, John teaching Audrey to ride a bike, a picnic near the river, the the two of them sitting on a porch with sunlight on their faces. Luke felt something close to warmth stirring in his chest. These were not just images of strangers. They were fragments of a promise, a man's belief that the world could still be kind. He placed one of the photos aside, the one of John and Audrey at the gates. He would keep it safe. The rest he returned to the box, closed the lid, and slipped both the letter and the photo into his jacket pocket. By late morning, Luke and Kaiser walked toward the city. The air carried the hum of distant traffic and the faint smell of burnt coffee from nearby shops. The world above the steelworks felt too alive, too loud. Yet he needed to blend into it again, to become part of the crowd, just long enough to trace the name from a letter into a living person. They reached the Carnegie Library by midday. The stone building rose like a quiet monument to knowledge, its steps dusted with fresh snow. Luke hesitated outside. A "No Pets Allowed" sign hung near the door. He looked at Kaiser. "You wait here, partner. I won't be long." Kaiser sat obediently by the side wall, his breath forming soft clouds in the air. Luke gave him a quick pat on the head, then pushed open the heavy doors and stepped inside. The warmth hit him like a wave. It smelled of paper and polish, a clean scent that almost hurt after weeks of rust and dust. He moved carefully among the shelves until he reached the public computers. His fingers, stiff from the cold, trembled slightly as he typed Audrey Lawson, Pittsburgh. The screen blinked, then filled with results. He scrolled slowly, reading headlines, social media links, news articles. The name appeared again and again: Audrey Lawson, community activist, environmental advocate, spokesperson for the River Renewal Project. Luke leaned closer. One article caught his eye. Local activist Audrey Lawson leads opposition against real estate tycoon Calvin Bishop's plan for the Riverfront District. His pulse quickened. Calvin Bishop. The same man who had destroyed her father. Luke clicked the article. A photograph loaded a woman in her 30s, standing before a microphone, hair tied back, eyes steady. Her expression carried both strength and exhaustion, the same fire he had seen in John's face. The caption read, Audrey Lawson speaks out against corruption and unsafe land development. He sat back in the chair, exhaling slowly. She had grown up to fight the same war her father died for. The circle had come around. Luke printed the article, folded it carefully, and slid it into his pocket. Then he took one last look at the photo on the screen before signing off and heading outside. Kaiser stood exactly where he had left him, snow resting lightly on his fur. The dog's tail wagged when he saw Luke. "Good boy," Luke said softly. "We found her." He crouched beside the dog, thinking. He couldn't just walk up to her. If Bishop's people were still watching her, if they knew what he carried, it would put her in danger. He needed to reach her quietly without leaving a trail. That night, back at the steelworks, Luke sat at the desk in the security office with a pen and a piece of yellowed paper. His handwriting was rough, but steady. "Miss Lawson, you don't know me, but I have something that belonged to your father. He died trying to protect the truth, and I believe you are still fighting for that same truth now. Please meet me at Shenley Park near the old stone fountain tomorrow afternoon at 3. Bring no one. This is not a threat. It's a promise of answers. A friend of your father." He stared at the letter for a moment, then folded it carefully. From his jacket, he took the photo of John and little Audrey. The edges were worn, but the faces still glowed with life. He slipped the photo inside the envelope, sealed it, and wrote on the front, in block letters, for Audrey Lawson. The next morning, as the first sun touched the skyline, Luke walked to a corner mailbox downtown. He slid the envelope through the slot and watched it disappear into the dark. It was a small motion, but it carried the weight of everything he had left. As he walked back toward the river, Kaiser trotting beside him, the cold wind whipped against his face. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like punishment. It felt like movement, like purpose. Somewhere across the city, a woman named Audrey Lawson would soon open a letter from a stranger. And when she did, the past her father had died to protect would begin to rise again. Luke didn't know how it would end. He only knew one thing: the mission had begun. The sky hung low over Pittsburgh that Saturday, a pale gray sheet that threatened snow but never quite delivered. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of wet earth and stone. Shenley Park lay quiet, except for the rustle of bare branches and the crunch of leaves underfoot. Luke sat on a wooden bench near the old stone fountain, his coat pulled close, a wool cap shadowing his eyes. Kaiser sat at his feet, calm but alert, tail still, ears raised. The world around them felt slow and waiting. Luke checked his watch. It was almost 3. He had come early, not out of impatience, but habit. Soldiers always arrive first. It gives them time to study the ground. When footsteps echoed along the path, he looked up. A woman approached her, stride brisk and guarded. Audrey Lawson. She was exactly as the newspaper photo had shown. Dark hair pulled back, posture straight, a scarf looped neatly around her neck. But her eyes held more than determination. They held exhaustion, the kind born from fighting too long without knowing who to trust. She stopped a few feet away, arms crossed. "You're the one who sent the letter?" Luke nodded once. "Yes." She glanced at Kaiser, then back at him. "And who are you exactly?" "Just someone who found something that belongs to you." Her tone sharpened. "That's what they all say. You have no idea how many emails I get, people claiming they have information. Usually it ends with them asking for money or trying to scare me off my work." Luke met her stare calmly. "I don't want your money." "Then what do you want?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out the envelope he had brought. He didn't hand it over right away. "I found something hidden in an old storage unit. A letter. And this photo." He extended it slowly toward her. Audrey hesitated, watching him for a beat before taking it. Her gloved fingers brushed the edge of the picture. The sight of it made her breath catch. It was the photo of her and her father standing in front of the Meridian Steelworks gates, the smile on her father's face, the sunlight on his hair, the way his hand held hers. It all returned like a sudden flood. Her voice broke slightly. "Where did you get this?" Luke's tone stayed low even. It was hidden behind a false wall in a storage unit registered under the name Theodore Lawson. "He left something for you." Audrey looked up sharply. "My Uncle Theo." Luke nodded. "Yes, he wrote you this before he died." He handed her the folded letter, the one he had copied carefully from the original. She took it with trembling hands and read silently. The only sounds were the faint trickle of water in the fountain and Kaiser's quiet breathing. When she reached the end, she pressed the paper to her chest and turned away, her shoulders shaking. "He was alive all these years," she whispered. "And he never called. I thought he was gone like the rest of them." Luke waited. He had seen grief before in battlefields and hospital tents. There was no rushing it. After a long silence, Audrey turned back, her eyes red but steady. "You've read it, yes? Then you know what this means." Luke nodded. "Your father's death wasn't an accident." Her jaw tightened. "I always suspected. Every time I asked questions, records disappeared. My father's files were gone. The city claimed there was no evidence. And now Bishop," she stopped scanning the park, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Bishop's company is back. They're building on the same land, the same poison under the ground." Luke studied her face, the fear behind her calm. "You've been fighting him." "For months," she said. "But lately, things have changed. My phone's been hacked. My car alarm goes off at random hours. Last week, someone broke into my office but took nothing. Her eyes flicked to the tree line. "Sometimes I think someone's watching me." Luke followed her gaze. The park looked empty, but still the hairs on his neck stood up. His instincts hadn't failed him yet. "How did you find me?" she asked suddenly. "I didn't find you," he said. "I found the truth. You were part of it." Audrey folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her coat pocket. "You said there was more. Where is it?" Luke hesitated, glancing toward the distant hills. "It's safe. Hidden in a place no one would think to look. Where?" "The old steelworks," he said softly. "Under the factory floor." Audrey's expression flickered, fear, disbelief, then a hint of awe. "You mean it's still there?" He nodded. "I buried it myself. A metal case with locks. Whatever your father and Theo were protecting, it's inside." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You don't know what you've stepped into. Bishop has eyes everywhere. He owns the city council, the media, half the contractors in the state. If his people even suspect you're connected to this, you're in danger." Luke's voice stayed calm. "Danger doesn't scare me anymore." Audrey shook her head, frustrated and afraid. "You don't understand. He's been following me. If they saw me meet you here." She froze mid-sentence, her gaze fixed on something beyond Luke's shoulder. Across the park, a black SUV had pulled into the far lot. Two men stepped out, pretending to stretch their eyes, scanning the paths. They weren't there for a walk. Luke caught the look in her eyes and didn't need to turn around. He'd seen that type before, professional, deliberate. "Walk with me," he said quietly. Audrey hesitated. "Who don't look at them?" Luke murmured. "Just walk." He stood Kaiser, rising instantly beside him, muscles tense but quiet. They moved down the gravel path, slow and steady, like two people leaving a casual meeting. Audrey's hands shook slightly at her sides. "They're following, aren't they?" Luke nodded once. "Probably. What do we do?" "Keep walking," he said, "and don't stop until we're in the open street." The crunch of boots behind them grew fainter as the sound of city traffic took over. When they reached the main road, Luke glanced over his shoulder. The SUV was still in the lot, but the men were gone. He turned to her. "Go home. Don't tell anyone about this." "Not yet." Her voice trembled. "And you, I'll make sure the evidence stays safe." Audrey stared at him, torn between gratitude and fear. "Why are you doing this for us? You don't even know me." Luke looked past her to the gray sky over the city. "Because I've seen what silence costs," he said simply. "And I'm done staying quiet." Audrey took a step closer, her voice soft. "My father believed one person could make a difference, even when no one else listened." Luke gave a small nod. "Then maybe it's time someone finished what he started." The wind picked up, carrying the sound of church bells from somewhere far off. Audrey pulled her scarf tighter, eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope. "If they find out..." "They won't," Luke said. "Not yet. The old factory's a ghost town. No one goes there." He gave her one last look, steady and firm. "You'll hear from me soon." Audrey wanted to say more, to ask a dozen questions, but the words stuck in her throat. She nodded once, holding the photo against her chest as if it were a heartbeat. As she turned and walked away, Luke watched her disappear into the misty gray of the park. Kaiser sat beside him, eyes following until she was gone. Luke exhaled, the cold biting his lungs. The men from the SUV hadn't moved yet, but he knew they would. He reached down and patted Kaiser's head. "We're not done yet, partner." The dog looked up, ears twitching, waiting for the next order. Luke adjusted his coat, his mind already on the road back to the steelworks, the one place where the truth was still buried, waiting to be unearthed. The sky was the color of smoke when Audrey's car pulled off the main road and into the forgotten district. The air grew colder as they neared the broken gates of Meridian Steelworks. Snow had begun to fall again, thin flakes scattered by the wind, glinting faintly in the headlights. Luke sat in the passenger seat silent, his hand resting on Kaiser's back in the rear seat. The dog's eyes followed the shadows outside his body, tense and alert. The factory loomed ahead, massive and rusted, a skeleton of its old self. "You're sure it's here?" Audrey asked, gripping the steering wheel. "I buried it myself," Luke said quietly. "No one's touched it since." Her voice carried a tremor. "If they followed us, they won't catch us," Luke said. "Not if we move fast." Audrey didn't answer, but her knuckles whitened as she steered through the cracked gate. The car's tires crunched over broken glass and ice. The place looked like another world, silent, colorless, haunted by the sound of their own engine. They stopped near the small brick building that had once been the security office. Its door hung crooked, half frozen in place. Luke stepped out first, scanning the area. His breath came out in short clouds. "Stay close," he said. Kaiser jumped out beside him, landing soundlessly on the snow. The dog's ears twitched, his head turning slowly toward the open factory floor. Audrey hesitated, then followed them inside. The air smelled of rust and old fire. Her boots echoed softly as she crossed the cracked concrete. "I don't like this place," she whispered. "Neither do I," Luke replied. "But it keeps secrets better than people." They reached the office. Luke pushed the door open, with his shoulder, the hinges groaning in protest. The inside was dim lit only by the fading light through the dirty window. Dust hung in the air like fog. Kaiser moved first, nose low, steps careful. Then suddenly, he froze. His body went rigid, muscles tight, ears forward. A low growl rolled from his throat, a sound deep and certain. Luke's instincts kicked in. "Audrey," he said quietly. "Step back." From the shadows near the far wall, two shapes unfolded like pieces of the dark coming alive. The first man was tall and lean, his black coat hanging open to reveal a pistol at his side. The second was broader, with a scar that cut through his beard. Their eyes were sharp, assessing. "Evening," the tall one said. His voice was calm but heavy with threat. "You're trespassing." Luke didn't move. "So are you." The tall man smiled faintly. "Name's Nick Sullivan. My friend here is Eric Dalton. We work for a man who owns this property." He stepped closer, boots crunching on the dirt. "You've been poking around where you shouldn't." Audrey's breath caught. "Calvin Bishop sent you?" Sullivan tilted his head. "Smart girl." Luke shifted slightly, keeping his body between Audrey and the men. Kaiser moved with him, growl deepening. Dalton's eyes flicked to the dog. "That thing's trained." Luke didn't answer. Sullivan smirked. "You're a soldier, aren't you? I can tell. The way you're standing, the way you don't blink when someone has a gun pointed at you." He tapped his jacket pocket lightly. "But let me give you a bit of advice, soldier. Sometimes it's better to forget what you find." Luke's tone stayed even. "You think threatening me changes anything?" Sullivan shrugged. "Not you. But maybe the lady. She's got a career, people who listen when she talks. Shame if that stopped." Audrey's voice shook but didn't break. "You can't scare me into silence." Dalton chuckled. "Everyone's scared of something." Kaiser's growl turned into a sharp bark. The sudden sound echoed like a gunshot in the small room, startling even Sullivan. Luke used that second to step forward, his voice low and firm. "You've said your piece. Now leave." Sullivan's eyes hardened. "Watch yourself, Morgan." That caught Luke off guard for a fraction of a second. He hadn't said his name. Sullivan smiled at the flicker of surprise. "See, we know who you are, we know your record, and we know you've got something that doesn't belong to you." He leaned in close enough that Luke could smell the faint scent of cigarette smoke on his coat. If you're smart, you'll put it back and walk away. Luke didn't blink. If you're smarter, you'll start walking now. For a moment, no one moved. Then Sullivan gave a short laugh. Suit yourself. He nodded at Dalton. Let's go. The two men stepped back into the shadows and disappeared through the side door, their footsteps fading into the wind outside. Audrey exhaled sharply. They know your name. Doesn't matter, Luke said. We're leaving. He crossed the room quickly, pulling the floorboard away from the spot where he had hidden the tunnel entrance. The air that rose from below was cold and stale. Stay here, he told her, dropping to one knee. Kaiser followed as Luke disappeared into the narrow tunnel beneath the floor. A few minutes later, he returned, dirt on his hands, carrying the metal ammunition box. It looked the same as the day he buried it, cold, solid, heavy with truth. Got it, he said. They didn't waste another second. As they left the office, a faint sound caught Luke's ear. A car door slamming somewhere outside. Then another. He grabbed Audrey's arm. Run! They sprinted across the open factory floor, Kaiser leading the way. Their footsteps rang against metal, echoing off the high ceiling. From behind came the shouts, Sullivan's voice, angry now, echoing through the dark. Stop them! Luke didn't look back. He moved fast, weaving between rusted machines, pulling Audrey with him. Kaiser darted ahead, barking once a warning signal, sharp and clear. They reached the side exit and burst into the freezing air. The wind cut across the lot, carrying the growl of engines starting. Audrey fumbled for her keys, hands shaking. Come on, come on. Luke shoved the metal box into the back seat, Kaiser jumping in after it. As soon as Luke slid into the passenger seat, Audrey hit the gas. The tires spun on the icy ground, before catching grip, throwing them forward. Behind them, headlights flared. The black SUV roared to life and gave chase. Faster, Luke said calmly, eyes on the mirror. I'm trying, Audrey hissed, steering through the narrow streets that wound away from the factory. The snow made the pavement slick, every turn a gamble. The SUV stayed close, its lights flashing like a predator's eyes. Kaiser growled from the back seat, body pressed against the window. They're gaining, Audrey shouted. Luke scanned the road ahead. Next left, there's an underpass. She turned sharply, the car's skidding tires shrieking against the ice. The SUV followed, sliding dangerously close to the concrete wall. Luke could see Dalton in the passenger seat, yelling into a radio. The sound of sirens rose in the distance. Maybe police, maybe another trick. It didn't matter. Audrey pushed harder, her fear burning into anger. They killed my father, she said through clenched teeth. They destroyed everything he worked for, and they think they can do it again. Luke's voice stayed steady. Then don't let them. She met his eyes for half a second. The determination there was fierce, clear. I won't. The car shot out of the underpass, tires throwing slush. The SUV clipped the edge of a snowbank and spun out, sliding sideways across the road. Audrey kept driving until the sound of engines faded behind them. Only when they reached the edge of the city did she finally slow down. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel. Luke looked back, the road behind them, empty now, swallowed by snow and fog. He turned to her. You okay? Audrey nodded, but her jaw was tight. No, she said after a moment. But I'm angry, and that's better than being afraid. Luke leaned back, his pulse steadying. Good. You'll need that. Outside, snow kept falling soft and endless. The city lights glowed faintly in the distance. Audrey kept her eyes on the road ahead, her voice low but firm. They tried to bury my father's truth, she said. Now I'll make sure the whole world hears it. Kaiser gave a low bark, as if agreeing. Luke looked out the window, the reflection of the falling snow ghosting across the glass. "Then let's finish what they started," he said. And with that, the car disappeared into the white blur of the night. 3 shadows moving toward the heart of the storm, carrying the weight of a secret too heavy to hide any longer. The snow had turned to a light rain by the time Luke, Audrey, and Kaiser reached the edge of the old industrial district. The city lights were faint behind them, blurred by fog. Luke checked the folded note in his pocket again, an address scribbled in shaky handwriting. Mac Riley, 214 Riverbend Workshop. Audrey drove the car slowly down the narrow lane lined with old brick warehouses. Most were dark, their windows boarded or broken. One, however, glowed with a soft orange light from within. A small wooden sign hung over the door, Riley Investigations. "This is it," Luke said. Audrey looked doubtful. "You trust this guy?" Luke nodded. "He's the real thing. Retired FBI. Used to be one of the good ones. He worked the Bishop case years ago." She parked by the curb and they stepped out. Kaiser stayed close, tail low, but steady, nose twitching as he scanned the air. Luke knocked twice. A moment later, the door opened, revealing a man in his late 60s, broad shoulders, gray beard, eyes sharp as a hawk's. He wore a flannel shirt and oil-stained gloves, and the smell of metal and coffee drifted from the workshop behind him. "Luke Morgan," he said in a gravelly voice. "I thought you were a ghost." "Still breathing," Luke replied. "You're the only one I could trust with this." Mac Riley stepped aside, motioning them in. "Bring the dog. He's smarter than half the people I've worked with." Inside the workshop looked like a cross between an old mechanic's shop and a small investigation lab. Tools hung neatly on the walls beside framed newspaper clippings, articles about criminal busts, missing persons, and one headline that caught Audrey's eye: FBI agent Mac Riley challenges corruption probe closure. The date read 1997. "You were on my father's case," she said quietly. Mac glanced at her. "John Lawson's daughter?" She nodded. He sighed and rubbed his temples. "Your father was a good man. Too honest for the city he lived in. Bishop made sure every piece of evidence against him vanished. I tried to push the case forward, but they shut it down. Transferred me 3 weeks later." Luke unzipped his duffel bag and set the metal box on the table. Its surface gleamed dully under the light. Mac whistled low. "You really found it." "It was buried under the steelworks," Luke said. "Theo Lawson left it there before he died." Mac leaned closer, studying the triple locks. Old military issue. Tough, but not impossible. He picked up a set of small tools from a tray, thin rods, picks, and a stethoscope-like device. "Give me a minute." As he worked, the room filled with soft metallic clicks. Luke and Audrey stood back watching. Kaiser paced the floor, ears twitching at every sound. Audrey's voice broke the silence. "If this proves what my father found, will it be enough to stop Bishop?" Mac didn't look up. "Enough to burn him to the ground," he said quietly. "But that's only if you live long enough to show it." After a tense few minutes, there was a faint click. One lock sprang open, then another. Finally, with a deep exhale, Mac twisted the last dial and lifted the lid. Inside lay a stack of ledgers, old permits, photographs, and a weathered leather journal. On top of it all sat a small tape recorder, the kind reporters used decades ago. The label on it read, March 11th, 1996, J.L. Audrey's hand went to her mouth. "That's my father's handwriting." Mac adjusted his glasses and began flipping through the ledgers. Each page was filled with columns of numbers, signatures, and company seals. "Here it is," he muttered. "Shell accounts, fake permits for hazardous waste disposal. Bishop bought city inspectors' forged safety reports. This is a roadmap of the entire cover-up." Luke picked up the journal. The first few pages were smudged, but the words still spoke with quiet force. John Lawson's notes about contamination levels, community meetings, his fears that Bishop was sabotaging his work. The final entry read, "If anything happens to me, Theo will know what to do. Truth doesn't die. It just waits for someone brave enough to dig it up." Audrey's eyes glistened. He knew. He knew they were coming. Mac handed her a tissue, his expression softening. "Your father was trying to protect you. He came to me once, said he was close to exposing Bishop. A week later, his office exploded." Luke turned the tape recorder over in his hands. "We need to hear this." Mac nodded. "Plug it in." He connected it to an old speaker system on his desk and pressed play. The tape hissed, then a voice emerged, steady, thoughtful, unmistakably human in its calm. "This is John Lawson. If you're hearing this, I didn't make it. I have proof that Calvin Bishop and his partners falsified every cleanup report on the Meridian site. They've buried toxic waste beneath the riverbank and paid off the city council to approve construction. If these documents reach the press, they'll know the truth. Tell my daughter I love her. Tell her I never gave up." The tape clicked to a stop. For a long time, no one spoke. Even Kaiser seemed frozen, as if sensing the weight of what they had just heard. Audrey's voice came out in a whisper. "We have everything. We can go to the police, the news." Mac shook his head sharply. "Not yet. Bishop has people everywhere. The moment this goes public without protection, it disappears again. You need leverage, someone untouchable to hold it." Before Luke could answer, Kaiser suddenly lifted his head and growled. A low warning sound that filled the small room. His fur bristled. Mac turned off the light and moved to the window. Peering through a narrow gap in the blinds, his jaw tightened. Outside, parked across the street, sat a black sedan with tinted windows. Two silhouettes sat inside, motionless, watching. "Sullivan and Dalton," Luke muttered. "Yeah," Mac said. "Bishop's dogs. They've been sniffing around this neighborhood for months." Audrey stepped closer, fear flashing in her eyes. "They found us." "Probably followed your car," Luke said. "They won't wait long." Mac was quiet for a moment, thinking fast. Then his expression hardened into something resolute. "We're not all leaving through the same door." Audrey frowned. "What? I'll take the box," Mac said. "They want it more than you. I'll lead them away. You two slip out the back through the alley behind the workshop. There's an old stairway that goes down to the river trail. It'll take you straight out of this district." "No," Audrey said. "They'll kill you." Mac smiled faintly. "They won't. They'll think they're chasing the prize. That's the difference between being hunted and being bait." Luke shook his head. "I'm not letting you do this alone." "You don't have a choice," Mac said firmly. "You've got something Bishop can't afford to lose. You and the girl get it to someone who can fight back." He grabbed his coat and tucked the box under his arm. "I've been chasing Bishop's shadow for 20 years. Feels right to end it this way." Luke hesitated, then extended his hand. "Thank you, Mac." Mac shook it firmly. "Don't thank me yet. Just make sure the truth survives." He turned to Audrey. "Your father would be proud of you." She blinked hard, nodding once. "Please be careful." Mac gave a small grin. "Always am." He switched on the workshop's exterior lights, flooding the street with a harsh glare. The sudden brightness startled the men in the car. They looked up as Mac stepped outside, locking eyes with them. Inside, Luke motioned for Audrey to move. They slipped out the back door, Kaiser at their side, paused silent on the wet ground. The alley was narrow and dark, lined with barrels and old wiring. Behind them, they heard the faint sound of Mac's voice calling out, sharp and confident, "You boys looking for me?" followed by the slam of a car door. Audrey stopped once, looking back toward the light spilling through the cracks in the workshop door. "He's going to get himself killed." Luke placed a hand on her shoulder. "He knows what he's doing. We keep moving." They hurried down the alley until it opened onto a narrow path leading to the river. The rain had turned heavier, masking their footsteps. From somewhere behind them came the sound of engines revving, then fading, heading in the opposite direction. Mac had done his part. As they reached the end of the trail, Luke looked back once his face lit by the faint orange reflection of streetlights. "He bought us time," he said. Audrey's voice trembled. "Then we can't waste it." Kaiser pressed close to them, ears flicking as they disappeared into the night, two figures and a loyal shadow, carrying the last hope of a man who had died for the truth. Behind them, in a city that had forgotten how to listen, an old agent faced his past one last time, giving the next generation a chance to finish what began 30 years ago. Rain turned the streets slick and silver as Mac's old pickup disappeared into the distance, its taillights shrinking between rows of warehouses. The low rumble of its engine blended with the night until it was gone. Luke, Audrey, and Kaiser slipped through the back alleys, keeping to the shadows. Every noise felt louder than it should, the drip of rain, the crunch of wet gravel under boots, the distant echo of tires against puddles. "Are you sure this way is safe?" Audrey whispered, hugging her coat close. Luke nodded. "It's not safe. It's unpredictable." "That's better." Kaiser moved ahead, his fur slick with rain nose, working constantly. The dog's silent focus steadied Luke more than any weapon ever could. They reached the end of the alley where a chain-link fence cut off the path. Luke crouched, lifted a loose corner, and motioned Audrey through. She hesitated only a moment before crawling under her breath, coming fast from cold and exhaustion. Just as Luke followed, Kaiser froze, ears pricking. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Luke turned too late. A figure was already stepping out from the shadows behind a dumpster. The glint of a pistol flashed in the weak light. It was Dalton, one of Bishop's men, soaked and furious, having doubled back on foot. "End of the line," Dalton said, voice hoarse. "Where's the box?" Luke didn't answer. He didn't have to. One look at Kaiser, muscles coiled and waiting, said everything. "Easy," Luke murmured to the dog under his breath. Then louder to Dalton, "You should have stayed with your boss," Dalton sneered. "You think that mutt's going to save you?" Luke's voice stayed level. "No, I am." He gave a short hand signal. Kaiser shot sideways into the shadows circling. Dalton turned his gun toward the sound. A moment later, a sharp bark exploded from the opposite direction, loud echoing through the alley. Dalton flinched, spinning just as Luke lunged forward. He slammed into Dalton's arm, knocking the gun to the ground. The weapon clattered into a puddle and skidded out of reach. Luke's fist followed fast, a clean strike to the jaw. Dalton staggered back, then crumpled against the fence. Luke scooped up the gun, ejected the magazine, and tossed both into a nearby drain. He grabbed Kaiser's collar gently, steadying the dog's breathing. "You did good, boy," he whispered. Audrey stood frozen a few steps away, eyes wide. "You could have been killed." Luke glanced at her. Rain dripped from the brim of his cap. "Could have," he said simply. "But we weren't." She stared at him for a long moment, then nodded silently, following, as he led them through another narrow street. By the time they reached the edge of the city, Audrey's steps had slowed. Her breath came in short gasps, her face pale. The adrenaline that had carried her through the night was fading fast, leaving only cold and fatigue. Luke noticed her stumble. He caught her arm before she fell. "You're freezing." "I'm fine," she said weakly, but her lips trembled. "No, you're not." He looked around. The streets were empty, the rain still falling in thin sheets. There was only one place left where they could hide, at least until dawn. "The steelworks," he said. Audrey blinked. "We're going back there." "They'll never think we would," Luke replied. "That's exactly why it'll work." He led her through the industrial ruins until the familiar outline of the Meridian Steelworks rose again through the mist, black, silent, immense. The broken gates groaned as they pushed through. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of rust and oil. Water dripped from the rafters like slow-ticking clocks. Luke guided Audrey to the same small security office that had once been their refuge. It was colder than before, but still shelter. Luke searched the corners until he found a dented metal barrel. He pulled a handful of old wooden planks from a shelf, broke them in half, and stacked them inside. A flick of his lighter, and a faint orange flame began to grow, snapping and crackling until the shadows retreated. Audrey crouched near it, holding her hands over the fire. Her face glowed in the light, pale, tired, but still beautiful in a way that wasn't about looks at all. Luke sat across from her, back against the wall. He reached into his pack and pulled out half of a ration bar, offering it silently. She smiled faintly. "You're sharing your last meal?" He shrugged. "You'll think clearer if you eat." She broke the bar in two and handed half back. "Then so will you." They ate in silence, the only sound the crackle of fire and the steady patter of rain outside. Kaiser lay between them, his head resting on Audrey's knee, soaking up warmth from both sides. After a long time, Audrey spoke softly. "When I first saw you under that bridge, I thought you were just another man who gave up." Luke's eyes lifted. The firelight flickered across the scars on his face. "Maybe I had," he said. "Until now." She watched him closely, her voice almost a whisper. "You're not what I expected?" He gave a faint smile. "What did you expect? A stranger chasing ghosts?" she said. "But you're steady. You think before you move. You protect people without even thinking about it." Luke looked down at the flames. "Old habits." Audrey tilted her head. "From the war?" He nodded once. "Afghanistan. Too many friends didn't come back. The ones who did. We learned to keep moving no matter what." Her voice softened. "That's what my father believed too. That people like you were the only reason the world still had a chance." The room fell quiet again. The fire's light danced across the cracked walls, casting long, gentle shadows. Kaiser stirred, pressing closer to Audrey, his warmth grounding her back into the present. Luke watched the flames, his voice low. "We'll wait here till morning. Once the road's clear, we find somewhere safe. Then we get this story out." Audrey nodded, her eyes reflecting the fire. "For my father," she said. "And for the ones they buried with lies," Luke added. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint hum of the river. Inside, the fire burned stronger, steady and sure, like the quiet resolve between them. Audrey looked at Luke one last time before resting her head against the wall. "You're not a beggar," she murmured, half asleep. "You're a soldier who never stopped fighting." Luke said nothing. He just watched the fire, the faint rise and fall of her breathing, and the loyal dog keeping guard beside her. For the first time in years, the old factory didn't feel like ruin. It felt like the beginning of something that still had a chance to live. The first light of dawn spilled across the cracked windows of the old steelworks. Thin rays touched the floor where the fire had burned low during the night. Kaiser stirred first, lifting his head at the sound of footsteps outside. His tail thumped once, soft, cautious. Luke reached for the metal pipe he kept near the door, but before he could stand, a familiar voice called out quietly, "Easy, soldier." "It's me." He lowered the pipe and opened the door. Mac Riley stood there, soaked to the knees, his flannel shirt streaked with mud and his breath misting in the cold morning air. Audrey jolted awake, disbelief flashing across her face. "You made it." Mac gave a tired grin. Took a few creative turns along the way. But yeah, they followed the bait long enough for me to drop the package where it needed to go. Luke clapped a hand on his shoulder. "The box," delivered, Mac said. "Safe in the hands of someone who knows how to use it." He stepped inside, pulling the door closed behind him. The smell of rain and exhaust followed him in. Chloe Park, he continued. She's my old contact, best lawyer I ever worked with at the bureau. I called her before I even left town. She met me halfway and took the evidence straight to her office. Audrey blinked. Chloe Park, the environmental lawyer? That's the one, Max said. Smart, fearless, and allergic to corruption. She's already teamed up with an investigative journalist named Jake Miller. The two of them are building a case that's going to hit Bishop where it hurts public trust. Luke nodded slowly. So it begins. Mac took a seat on an overturned crate, rubbing his hands over the faint warmth still rising from the barrel fire. Chloe's already digging. She said the files from John's box opened a dozen new doors, permits payments, fake safety reports tied to at least 6 other developments Bishop ran through shell companies. Audrey's eyes widened. You mean my father wasn't the only one? Mac shook his head. Not even close. Chloe's finding patterns, accidents, chemical leaks, sudden disappearances of whistleblowers. Bishop's been playing this game for decades. But now, for the first time, we've got a thread that ties it all together. Audrey sat forward, hands clasped. Then we have to go to the police, to the press, everyone. Mac lifted a hand. And we will. But we do it smart. Bishop's still powerful. If we hit too early, he'll bury us in lawsuits and smear campaigns. We need momentum, not chaos. Luke's voice was steady. Then what's the next step? Mac pulled a small notepad from his jacket. Chloe's building a coalition. She's reaching out to families of others hurt by Bishop's projects. People who lost their homes, their health, even their lives because of his shortcuts. Once they're ready, she'll hold a press conference. It'll make it impossible for the city to ignore. Audrey stared into the flickering fire. My father always said truth spreads fastest when it's carried by more than one voice. Luke gave a faint smile. He was right. As the morning grew brighter, Mac opened a thermos and poured coffee into 3 tin cups. Drink up, he said. You're going to need it. While they drank, he filled them in. Jake Miller's already verifying every document. He's digging through property records, cross-checking Bishop's contracts. The man Sharp got fired twice for publishing stories his editors couldn't stomach. Perfect ally. Audrey took a sip of the bitter coffee. So what happens now? Mac exhaled. Chloe plans to bring the evidence to the state attorney's office once the victim's statements are ready. But last night, while I was heading back here, she called me. Said she'd been contacted by Bishop's legal counsel. Luke's brows lifted. Already Mac nodded. They want a private meeting. Audrey's expression hardened. A trap, maybe Mac said. Or maybe Bishop's starting to sweat. Did she agree to it? Luke asked. She did, Mac said. But on one condition, that Bishop himself shows up. No lawyers hiding behind papers. She wants to look him in the eye. Audrey's pulse quickened. She's brave. Mac gave a small smile. That's why I trust her. She said something that stuck with me. You can't kill the truth, but you can make it walk into the room and shake your hand. Luke looked toward the light spilling through the doorway. When's the meeting this afternoon? Mac said. Downtown. Neutral ground, an old conference suite Bishop used to rent for charity events. Chloe insisted it be recorded. Jake will be nearby with the press ready if things go sideways. Audrey stood pacing slowly. He won't go down easy. He'll try to turn it all back on us. Mac nodded. That's why we're staying one step ahead. Chloe's already got statements from 2 former inspectors who worked under Bishop. Both claim they were paid to falsify safety reports. Luke rubbed his jaw. That'll be enough to start the avalanche, maybe Mac said. But remember, he survived worse storms. We have to expect retaliation. The room fell quiet. The fire hissed softly as rainwater dripped through the cracks above. Audrey finally broke the silence. "I want to be there," she said. "At the meeting?" Mac looked at her sharply. "Absolutely not. It's too risky." "I'm not hiding anymore," she said firmly. "He took my father, my uncle, and half this city's truth. If we're confronting him, I need to see it. I need him to see me." Luke's gaze met hers, steady understanding. "She's right," he said. "Bishop needs to face the people he hurt, and he needs to see we're not afraid." Max sighed heavily, then nodded. "Fine. But we do this carefully. I'll talk to Chloe, make sure there's backup nearby." Audrey took a deep breath, her voice trembling but strong. "All my life I've known Bishop's name as something powerful, respectable. He sponsored charity galas, gave speeches about rebuilding the city. My mother used to say he was the kind of man people trusted. I want him to see how that lie ends." Luke stood and began packing up what little they had left. "Then it's settled," he said. "We stand with Chloe." Kaiser rose too, stretching tail sweeping against the floor. Luke smiled faintly. "And he's coming too." Mac chuckled. "Good, we might need his instincts." By late morning, they were ready to move. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean and quiet. The city's skyline shimmered in the distance, glass towers rising above the fog. Mac loaded his old pickup with a few supplies and glanced at Luke. "You ever get tired of being in the middle of things like this?" Luke gave a dry smile. "Didn't know there was another way to live." Mac laughed softly and shook his head. "You really are something, Morgan." As they drove toward the city, the air inside the truck was heavy with anticipation. Audrey sat between them, holding the faded photograph of her and her father. Her thumb brushed across the image again and again, as if drawing strength from the memory. When they reached the downtown edge, traffic slowed. Mac parked a few blocks away from the meeting site in front of a quiet cafe. "Chloe's already inside," he said. "She called a few minutes ago. Bishop confirmed he's coming." Audrey stared out the window toward the glass building ahead. "So it's finally happening." Luke nodded. The man who thought he owned the truth is about to meet it face to face. Mac reached for his old leather coat and buttoned it up. "Then, let's go remind him some debts don't stay buried forever." The three of them stepped out into the pale daylight, the city humming quietly around them. Kaiser followed at Luke's heel, calm and watchful. Ahead, inside that polished building of glass and stone, waited the man who had built an empire from lies. And this time he wouldn't be facing ghosts, he'd be facing the living proof that truth had come back for him. The conference room at Chloe Park & Associates was quiet but heavy with tension. Frosted glass walls caught the morning light, throwing pale reflections across the long oak table. Files, documents, and copies of old photographs lay neatly arranged in front of Chloe, Audrey, Luke, and Mac. Kaiser sat near the window, alert, yet calm, his golden eyes fixed on the door. "Remember," Chloe said softly, straightening a stack of papers. "No anger, no shouting. We let him talk first. Then, we end it with the truth." Audrey nodded. Her hands trembled only slightly as she adjusted her father's old watch on her wrist. Luke stood behind her chair, silent, watchful every inch the soldier again. The door opened. Calvin Bishop entered with smooth confidence, the kind built over years of power. He wore a dark tailored suit and an expression carved from marble. His hair, now gray at the edges, gave him an air of dignity he didn't deserve. Beside him walked Chris Halden, his lawyer, and a young man in his 20s, Bishop's grandson, Ben. Ms. Park Bishop said pleasantly, "Always a pleasure to meet someone so ambitious." Chloe offered a polite nod. "Mr. Bishop, thank you for coming." He smiled as he took his seat at the head of the table. "I hear there's been some confusion about an old matter." "Something about Meridian Steelworks?" Audrey's voice cut through the air, steady, but tight. "You mean the site where my father was murdered?" Bishop gave a soft chuckle, as if humoring a child. Murdered? My dear, that's a strong word. What happened to John Lawson was a tragedy, an accident, nothing more. I understand grief makes people remember things differently. Luke's jaw tightened. His hands curled at his sides, but he said nothing. Chloe leaned forward, calm but unyielding. Let's save the rehearsed statements. We're here because we've reopened the case with evidence your team buried 30 years ago. Bishop arched a brow. Evidence. Chloe slid a thin folder across the table. Inside were copies of the ledger's permits and inspection records. Every fake safety report, every illegal payment. You signed most of them yourself. Halden, the lawyer, opened the folder, scanning quickly. His color drained slightly, but Bishop remained still. He closed the folder with care and looked up. You think old paperwork means something now? Statute of limitations, Ms. Park. You can't jail history. Chloe smiled faintly. Maybe not. But you can expose it. Ben shifted in his seat, uneasy. Grandfather, maybe we should quiet Ben, Bishop snapped. His mask slipped for half a second, revealing a flash of irritation. Then he turned back, his tone once again smooth. Ms. Lawson, let's be reasonable. You've built a good life for yourself, haven't you? The past doesn't have to destroy the future. I'm prepared to make you an offer. Audrey's expression didn't change. An offer? Bishop folded his hands. $5 million, tax-free. You sign a non-disclosure agreement and walk away. No more talk of your father. No more chasing ghosts. The room went silent. Even the city sounds outside felt distant. Audrey stared at him, her voice low. You think money erases what you did? It fixes what's broken. Bishop said simply. That's what it's always done. Chloe's eyes hardened. You just proved exactly why we called this meeting. Bishop leaned back, smiling. You're a smart lawyer, Miss Park. Surely you understand leverage. You don't have the kind of evidence that can survive court. It'll be your word against mine, and my word comes with better lawyers. Mac spoke up from the corner. You might want to rethink that. Bishop turned, annoyance flickering. And you are Mac Riley, he said evenly. FBI retired. I investigated you once. The report never saw daylight until now. Bishop's smile thinned. So, this is a performance? Chloe tapped the table lightly. No, Mr. Bishop. This is the beginning of accountability. Halden frowned. You've made your point. Now, unless you have actual proof? Chloe interrupted, her voice calm but sharp. Oh, we do. We have copies of every file, every payment record, and we've already contacted the families of your other victims. They've agreed to testify. Halden froze. Bishop's hands twitched just once. Mac crossed his arms. You didn't think people would compare notes, did you? The accidental gas explosion in 2002, the fire at Harborview plant, the collapse in Rivertown, all tied to your companies, all covered up the same way. Bishop stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. You're bluffing. Chloe didn't move. Her voice dropped to a quiet, lethal tone. No bluff. And one more thing, we have your voice. That stopped him cold. What, he asked softly. The tape, Chloe said. John Lawson recorded your meeting 3 days before the explosion. You told him to drop his report, or you'd handle it your way. Bishop's mask cracked. His face drained of color, then darkened with rage. You don't have that tape. Oh, we do, Chloe said. And the press will too by tonight. Ben looked at his grandfather, eyes wide with confusion and horror. Is it true? Bishop's voice broke into a growl. You don't understand what was at stake. That land was worthless. I built something real. People needed jobs. He was going to ruin everything. Audrey rose to her feet, trembling but defiant. He was trying to save lives. You destroyed them to build your empire. For a moment, Bishop looked like he might deny it again. But the words wouldn't come. His breath came faster, his composure slipping. Luke watched him quietly, every muscle tight. He'd seen that look before on men who'd thought they were untouchable. It was the same arrogance that had killed his friend overseas. The same calm cruelty that always dressed itself as leadership. Justice, he realized, wasn't a courtroom or a speech. It was this moment, the truth cornering the powerful, stripping away every lie they'd built to hide behind. Outside, faint but growing, came the wail of sirens. Chloe glanced toward the window. That'll be the police and the press. They'll want statements. Bishop turned on her, eyes blazing. You think you've won? This city runs on favors. People forget. Stories fade. Luke stepped forward, his voice low but cutting. Not this one. For the first time, Bishop looked uncertain. He turned toward the door as if calculating escape, but Halden stayed seated, pale and silent. Ben sank back, shame shadowing his face. The sirens grew louder, closer. Chloe gathered her papers and looked to Audrey. It's over. Audrey stood still for a moment, staring at Bishop, the man who had stolen her father's light and hidden it beneath concrete and greed. Then she spoke softly. No, it's beginning. Police lights flashed through the glass walls, painting the room in red and blue. Officers entered, calm and deliberate, led by a detective who nodded at Chloe. Mr. Bishop, the detective said we have some questions. Bishop said nothing. His empire, for the first time, was silent. As the officers escorted him away, Luke felt something settle in his chest. Not relief exactly, but release. The weight he'd carried for years, the anger and guilt and silence, finally broke apart in the quiet air. Kaiser padded over, pressing his head against Luke's leg. Luke reached down, resting a hand on the dog's fur. Audrey turned toward him, her eyes bright with tears she didn't hide. You kept your promise, she whispered. Luke shook his head gently. We did. Outside, the city was waking cars, honking birds, cutting through the cold air. But something deeper had shifted. A truth buried for decades was now unsealed, carried by the people brave enough to uncover it. Chloe packed the final folder, her voice soft. The case will take months, maybe years. But it's real now. And it's public. Luke looked at her, then at Audrey, and finally at Kaiser, who sat steady by the door, like a guardian of what they had all built. The fight's over, Luke said quietly. But the mission's not. Audrey smiled through her tears. Then let's rebuild what they tried to destroy. And as the morning sun broke fully through the clouds, lighting the glass and steel of the city outside the soldier, the daughter and the loyal dog stepped into the light, carrying not just justice, but the beginning of healing.